Esports has been a growing segment of the sports and entertainment landscape over the past 20 years, and more so now after the global pandemic shutdown. It has provided many sports networks with content to help replace the canceled traditional sports and has demonstrated that it is even more popular across the board. My guests on this episode will talk about how they help gaming companies broadcast those games, how they are able to innovate to make the games interactive, and what the future of esports looks like. Next on Sports in the Making. Thank you for joining me on Sports in the Making, a podcast where we find out what people in the sports and sports broadcasting industry do, how they've made an impact in the sports world, and how it all comes together. I'm your host, Don Cardona, and this is episode number 17. For the first time on Sports in the Making, I have a pair of guests that join me to talk the phenomenon that is esports. And I'm excited to share this episode because I learned a lot about what it takes to make those games happen on broadcasting platforms, and I knew it was a growing sport that many people still don't consider to be a traditional sport, although there can be arguments made for it. I grew up in the days of Atari and Intellivision, which, by the way, was my favorite console at the time, and I never thought playing games would ever evolve into competitions that could earn someone millions of dollars and be listed as a varsity collegiate sport. Yet this year so far, 2020, esports became go-to programming in recent weeks with the cancellation of the NBA, the NHL, Major League Baseball, and nearly every other sport imaginable. My guests on this episode have worked with gaming companies to produce these games to mass audiences around the world with a company called Atomic. I share some time with the principal of Atomic, Kris Dahl, one of the founders of the company, as well as Patrick Barthe, Director of eSports Partnerships. We'll talk about how Atomic operates, how technology is an important part of the way they create productions, and their thoughts on if esports could be a part of the Olympics in the future. This is my conversation on esports with Kris Dahl and Patrick Barthe. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me on this episode of Sports in the Making.
Great to be here. Thanks.
So we're talking esports and the growth and the future of esports with video production. What was it like prior to COVID-19 for esports, and what has it been since? I'll start off with you, Kris.
It's changed. Everybody that's in the live event industries have been hugely affected by all this, and we're no exception. Even though esports is something that can be done in an online space, certainly, video games can be played online and remotely. The sort of the heart of the esports culture and industry has been, live events at conventions or, professional events. So all of those are gone right now. So it's exclusively online content, exclusively online competition at this point, and probably will be for a little while. So that's had a pretty big impact. And a lot of production teams have been able to adapt, but it's still a very different space right now than it was 3 months ago.
Explain what it is that Atomic does. I would be able to explain it, but I would need probably another 30 minutes. So what does Atomic do, and how does that affect esports?
Sometimes we have a hard time explaining it as well. But fundamentally, we're a technology consulting company. We have software developers on our team. We have IT professionals on our team. And we have experienced global events team that does all kinds of live events, providing primarily technical and broadcast experience to bear on projects. So long story short, we basically come in and help esports events with all the technical stuff, broadcasting and things like that, all the hardware, the wires, the staffing, that sort of stuff to be able to pull off an event. It's usually we're partnering with publishers, we're partnering with brands that want to pull off events, and we're providing everything that needs to happen to pull that off. And so we do a lot of broadcast stuff. I mean, we got it like the traditional, almost exactly like a sports broadcast, but we're doing it with video games. So That's a big part of it. And then obviously with the difference between video game stuff and real sports, there's also that technical aspect of putting on the event. So in a lot of ways, we'll be the broadcast partner, but we also have to help support sort of the on-field experience. So all the computers and the video game consoles and the networking and that sort of part of it. So that's sort of the thing that I think was different about what we do versus a traditional sports broadcaster.
Patrick, what is your role as Director of Esports Partnerships?
One, I'm working with existing partners, so game publishers that, again, have some of these requirements to go produce a broadcast. And I'm also looking at new clients, bringing them in and telling them about our services and trying to onboard them. So typically I'm in more of the program management or client management, but my role can quickly shift over to some of the technical aspects, although I leave a lot of that to smarter folks like Kris and the team.
Kris, then how did Atomic start?
It's one of those things that this story is slightly more apropos today than it was a few months ago. But basically, my business partner and I, we got laid off when a company that we were working for was purchased by a large public company. And we got offered positions at the new company, but we required relocation to Texas. And so neither of us really wanted to do that with where we were positioned. I had just bought a house and things like that. So it was sort of just wasn't, an option.
Sure.
And so what we decided is, we decided to start an agency, a consultancy. And originally we weren't doing, we were doing a little bit of eSports work, but then it just sort of, I think it was just good timing. A lot of the work that we were doing just became new work and more work. And so it sort of kind of ballooned into, now it's probably over half of our business is just doing, eSports work.
Yeah. I know that some of my listeners are familiar with eSports on the surface, but what is it for people who may not know what it entails, how it's grown, and, the importance of it right now?
I think the key thing from my perspective is that I think if you just look, I don't know if any of your listeners have, 10-year-old kids, but look at the way that they consume media right now, right? Mm-hmm. They're not sitting in front of the TV all the time. They're on their laptops. They're watching YouTube. They're, some of the older kids are more watching Twitch and things like that. But it's just totally different than when I was a kid, the way that people consume media, right? And I'm not that old, but I'm old enough to remember when we used to sit and watch baseball on TV. I don't see that as much with the younger generations, but they're watching a ton of Minecraft content and they're watching a ton of Roblox stuff. And the older kids are watching Fortnite, mm-hmm. So that's also true going into the slightly older generations. They're, natively, familiar with watching Twitch streaming and watching gaming on online as opposed to traditional sports and other content stuff. So it's really interesting to see that in our lifetimes, that we're starting to see a shift from popularity of traditional sports into at least kind of a new thing. If not, people are going and watching new stuff. It's also, I think, to a certain degree, it's hurting the traditional sports viewership. I think some of the bigger sports are going to have some difficulty in the next 10, 15 years with viewership as these young kids that watch YouTube all the time and stuff are coming and becoming adults.
When we talked prior to joining this call, we talked about the history of sports, eSports. There's been a lot of games throughout the years. I think there had been competitions prior to, but as it's evolved, now we're getting into the television portion of the production, most evident in the last few weeks with this lockdown, where you've got NASCAR doing competitions, you've got other sports in there, NBA and all those things. How has that been welcomed in the broadcast world from the networks?
I think one of the things that's interesting about what's happening right now is you've got a situation where the common intersection is where traditional sports and esports are combining. So that's where I think you're seeing a lot of crossover content, a lot of crossover competition between traditional basketball properties and esports properties or racing. And we saw that quite a bit too with we did a lot of work with the Forza Racing Championship, which is a racing game. That was sort of one of the things that was really cool about it, is that it actually had a broad appeal to people of all generations, because, mm-hmm. I don't know if my dad could watch Dota, but he can certainly watch a NASCAR race, a digital NASCAR race, and understand what's going on. It doesn't require any additional cultural stuff. So networks need a fair bit of broad appeal typically. So I think it's only natural that they're looking at some of these traditional sports titles. Some of the, Counter-Strike and other games that are maybe not a traditional sports background are also gaining traction with the networks. PBS has done quite a bit, and ESPN, I think, has dabbled a little bit as well. But, a lot of the traditional networks are lagging behind, I think, culturally on this stuff right now. But they're playing catch up now because they have to.
Yeah.
There's no other option for content.
I haven't had the chance to watch a heck of a lot of it, just seeing some of the social media posts, and it's competitive. And the technology that's going into getting it on television is kind of what fascinated me. And one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on is, how would you approach putting on an esports event differently than the traditional way of covering sports, where a TV truck rolls in, you got your cameras, the event is completely the athletes, and then it's broadcast to headquarters and then to the rest of the country or world. You're taking it with a technology angle as well. That's got to be some kind of a challenge, right?
Yeah, there are some key differences in the way that the production is done. So in a lot of ways, it's really similar. We're often setting up, pretty complex productions with, 50 plus production crew on site to do a live event. And some of the events are much, much bigger. In that regard, you still got producers and graphics ops and replay operators and technical directors and all that. So you've got all the same pieces to the puzzle. But the things that's kind of different is that you've got your real cameras, and we still have camera chains and all that for the competitors that are in the space. So we have to record that content. That part of it has to be on the show of the people in the space. But we also have this virtual space we got to cover too. So with that, it really very much depends on the game. Some games have robust in-game camera systems. So we basically have virtual camera operators. Sometimes it's done in software. So there's automatic camera switching and covering the top action, things like that. There's some games that have instant replay capabilities in them. But a lot of games, they're really behind on that. And what we're actually doing is we're taking the camera position of the actual competitor. So we're basically bringing in, let's say we've got a 4 versus 4 match. We might have to take the 4 virtual cameras of each competitor, and hopefully we have a digital observer, which is sort of a virtual camera. Like I said, that sometimes those can be pretty sophisticated systems where we can kind of fly around the space as a drone. And some of the more forward-looking things like Overwatch actually does some things like that's actually designed for eSports. Because if you think about it, like a lot of the replay stuff that we do, we actually bring it into systems like EVS systems and, the same sort of replay tools that are used in traditional sports. But that's really limiting because you're capturing only what we run into the EVS system. So in a perfect world, we would actually be doing that in software so that, for example, if we get a really cool kill shot that doesn't quite cover the angles that we want, in software, we should be able to just play that back, move the camera to where it's the perfect position, or even, be able to do things like bullet time, which is, like moving around in the space as the replay is happening so that you're able to tell a more cohesive story. That's sort of some of the challenges and also some of the really cool things that you can do with esports that you might not be able to do with traditional sports.
All right, Patrick, maybe this is a question for you, but how do you guys find clients, number one, and how do you plan for that event to be executed?
Finding clients is pretty simple in terms of, just in our own backyard. Again, Atomic having some of the success it's had is because we're based out of Seattle, Washington. When you have clients here like Microsoft and its number of game titles, Nintendo, Valve, Wizards of the Coast, Amazon with Twitch, you have, I'd say that this is kind of an epicenter of a lot of gaming activity. So there's no shortage of folks to go communicate with and tell them what you're up to. But nevertheless, I'll typically be finding what's going on with any number of programs and reach out to individuals that are running them and tell them who we are and what we're doing and the projects that we're currently working on. During this COVID crisis, again, because of the skills we've had in doing broadcast production, we've seen a number of folks that are non-traditional seeing some of the skill sets we have and looking for us to kind of provide technical solutions for them based on what we do already. So I think every client is going to have different needs. Again, if it's straight technical production, that's one solution that we'll have. We can also manage talent. We can program manage for the actual live event side. It really is kind of no one size fits all. Again, sometimes we'll bring in a portion of our team to handle some of the web development, potentially some of the marketing, large scale networking. So it really kind of just depends on the size of the client and the program that they have and their requirements. But there is no one size fits all.
Part of that is also each program is very, very different. Some of the events that we'll do, we operate a small studio in Seattle, and we can do a totally virtual tournament. But most of our work is actually, we travel all over the globe. These programs are usually international programs. And so a lot of times we're working in dedicated eSports facilities. Sometimes we're, coming into like a ballroom or convention center and setting up something from scratch. And so we'll build a, video village and the tournament area and staging and lighting and all that sort of stuff. And sometimes, like in a really extreme case, we did an event a few years ago at 24-hour Le Mans where we actually had to build the building and build a village where we're going to sleep and live with caravans and things like that. And then bring in all the video equipment, truck it in, set it up, and then tear it all down. It really depends on kind of the scale, but the logistics can be substantial depending on where we're doing it and the scale of the project.
It's really interesting from a traditional broadcast sports perspective. I kind of know what goes into it, technology, and it always advances every year. But after talking with you guys a few weeks ago, there is so much more technology involved in all aspects of it. So how does that affect the viewer, and how does it affect the production?
Well, from a production thing, one of the things that's really starting to, kind of change our world, and I think it's changing almost every sport, is sort of using more REMI and at-home production techniques. So we're starting to see that that's becoming more and more popular. And certainly with the COVID stuff, like I think everybody that's doing this kind of work is investing pretty heavily right now in being able to do more remote production stuff because of the necessity. We were kind of heading in that direction already so that we can start doing some projects might not make sense at $500,000 or whatever the amount might be, but it does make sense at $190,000 or something like that. So there's some projects from a sort of technology perspective, the remote streaming at home kind of work is really kind of changing, I think, the entire industry. As far as viewing at home, I think some of the big technology pieces are just the prevalence of Twitch becoming a household name, frankly, for people that are at all in this industry or in this, familiar with video game stuff. I mean, it's if you think about it, 10 years ago, there wasn't a good infrastructure for sort of this model of watching live content on your computer.
Right.
Twitch really, I think, changed all that. And now it seems we take it for granted. Everybody can do live streaming, but that wasn't the case 10 years ago. So that's been a huge thing. It's just, there's so much more content to consume. And then on top of it, you've got, total democratization of that process where, the people that are big name, content providers, they don't come from a broadcast background. They're just personalities that are doing really well at creating their own content.
Okay, so I'm going to get into some of the titles that are out there for eSports. I'm not familiar with a lot of them, but I've heard of some of them. So Forza 7 Motorsport, Rocket League, which appears to be racing. Is that right?
Soccer with cars.
Soccer with cars.
Basically, yep.
Okay. Overwatch, which looks like a driving type of game.
Overwatch is sort of it's a lot like, it's a
first-person shooter.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Gotcha.
It's a team game, though.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. League of Legends. I've heard of that one. Dota 2. Looks like a fantasy game. Yeah,
Dota 2 is what they call a MOBA. It's definitely fantasy themed. It's a complex team game played kind of top down. It's not a first-person title, but that's a game that's extremely popular.
Yeah.
And it's pretty complex.
PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. StarCraft 2, Tekken 7, and then you've got leagues on top of that. So, and just looking at the numbers that you sent me earlier, the viewership for the League of Legends Championship in 2017 was 106.2 million. Those are not small numbers as compared to the 2018 Kentucky Derby with 15 million, and then 2018 Dota 2 International also with 15 million. Are those numbers accurate, and what do those tell you about the future of esports?
Both the League of Legends and Dota stuff, the Dota International have frankly outrated like the NBA Finals.
Wow.
I think part of it is it's crazy. I could be wrong on that, but it's from what I understand that it I recall that was one of the things that happened a couple of years ago. That was like a watershed moment when people realized that this isn't a small thing. The other one that's really interesting is that, where Major League Baseball has definitely some international viewers, it's largely an American phenomenon. Mm-hmm. Esports and those titles that you're talking about have huge followings in Asia and Europe and South America and Asia in particular, and China in particular. The viewership numbers are just hard to understand. where esports is in the United States, where we think about how of a big thing this is becoming, it's already a big thing in China. We just don't have as much exposure to it because of, culturally, we're pretty far apart. The numbers that we usually see when anything's broadcasted in China are just hard to really fathom.
Sure.
I think we've also seen players like Nielsen, who we've known from the television industry, but they're global analytics and data. They've worked on behalf of the brands that go in and get traditional ad buys to understand some sort of common metric amongst all these different programs, because large in part, the numbers that are being communicated to the public come from the game publisher themselves. And so it's been really helpful to have some standardization and understanding, especially for those brands who want to put their money and reach that customer behind it.
Well, you look at the NFL draft, which as of this recording happened last night, April 23rd. When you're looking at the signing bonuses and the contracts that these draftees will get, they're not numbers to scoff at by any means. But when you look at esports prize purses nowadays, some of the numbers are up there as well. How much can some of these guys make if they're good at what they do?
It varies significantly, but there's certainly the top players are getting, are making millions. And I think it's actually really similar to sports in some ways, because you have your prize purses and things like that. The teams are often paying salaries to the folks, and then they're pooling the resources and the winnings and all that and paying it out. So it's actually similar, I guess, to traditional sports in that regard. And like similar sports, a lot of the salaries and things are augmented by sponsorship deals, endorsements, things like that. It's a really similar model in terms of the most successful, financially successful players are also signing big endorsement deals and things like that. Also, this is sort of different than traditional sports. Some of those top personalities in esports are also creating their own content, and they're actually a content revenue streams that they're enjoying as well through streaming on Twitch. And as we know, there's many millionaires on Twitch right now that are or YouTube millionaires, things like that are creating content and adding that to their paychecks.
Just in July of this last year for Fortnite World Cup, I think we saw a teenager take home a prize purse of $3 million. So
not
clearly, not bad for a day's work.
Yeah. All right. I'm talking esports with Kris Dahl, the principal of Atomic, and Patrick Barthe, the director of esports partnerships, also with Atomic. Kris, you had mentioned culture acceptance with gaming in Asia. How does esports affect culture in general?
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of question. One of the things that when I start thinking about culture, there's a couple things that sort of hit me. One of them is like when I travel, I'm always surprised that there's something that can be popular somewhere where we have a lot in common culturally and not popular other places, like football or soccer. It's amazing that that's such a huge cultural phenomenon everywhere in the world, except for diminished slightly in the United States. Mm-hmm. Cricket's another one that is hard to understand, but when you go to some of the Commonwealth nations that are traditional British influence, they have large followers of cricket and rugby and things like that. And so when I go to these places and I see how popular that is, it's hard to kind of scratch your head a little bit and you go, I don't understand this. How is this so huge here? And we're also, have a lot of British influence. Like, how did it not catch on? So esports, I think in a lot of ways is similar to that there's a pretty big divide. I think it's less about geography and more about generational differences, probably. I think folks that played video games like to watch video games, and certainly that's changing a little bit more. I think it's swinging that direction even more, because now kids are growing up watching video games where that wasn't even an option when I was a kid. So, that's one part of it. I mean, I see that sometimes. Like, I remember when we went to China Joy for an event, which is the biggest gaming convention in the world, and that's in Shanghai. And I was on the subway, and I couldn't believe it that when I was walking around, I saw people that were on their phones watch every single one of them that I saw. And granted, this might have been, it just shocked me because I noticed it, but there was people on the subway and they were all watching somebody play a MOBA on their phones, and they weren't playing it. They were watching people. And that was just, like, it floored me, because I'm like, there's a lot of things about China that is different than the United States. But that was one thing that I remember being like, where I really realized that there is an actual huge cultural difference in where we are as societies in terms of adoption of esports content.
Speaking of that, what are some of the drawbacks that esports may have?
I think one of the biggest issues is fractionalization, or, where football is a distinct sport from soccer, which is a distinct sport from baseball. Esports kind of gets lumped in together a little bit, but if you look at it, it's actually thousands of individual games that are all being played. So it's sort of more similar to calling it, like field sports versus ring sports or boxing, fighting sports, things like that. So there's actually probably more variety in esports than there is in traditional sports, because you can be playing in space, or, dynamically, there's just so much more you can do in a video game. I think that's a little bit of a hard thing. What's kind of also a challenge with that is that, unlike Roger Goodell may run the NFL, but he doesn't own football. You know what I mean?
Right.
Where a lot of publishers, they own the game, they own the professional league, they own the broadcasting rights. It's something that is actually really beneficial for us, because it helps us be able to go and tell a comprehensive story, because these publishers look at this as a marketing spend to go, the more people that watch their game, the more people that are buying the game and buying the downloadable content inside the game. So they actually have a direct financial benefit for when the game is a popular esport. So that's motivating a lot of the spend in the industry, is the fact that the publishers directly benefit. But I think it's one of the things that's also going to be a little bit of a challenge, as publishers own the leagues and they own, maybe not a problem, but it's definitely different than traditional sports. And it's going to be one of the things that'll probably cause some issues in the future.
Many people question whether it is a sport or not. And I know that some universities are, providing scholarships and things of that nature to young people. Could esports have a future in the Olympics, perhaps?
Yeah, so we've definitely, a lot of that conversation has happened in the industry, and I know Patrick has had some conversations as well. I'm sure he has. You can chime in on this, but I think really what we're seeing is, I think from a perspective of, are these folks athletes? The hand-eye coordination and the amount of training and physical preparedness that the top-level esports athletes go through is maybe not quite on the same physical level as a traditional sports athlete, but they are spending the similar amount of hours training. They definitely do have a large physical component. I don't think people realize that when you've got these top esports athletes, that they are putting in a ridiculous amount of time to be as good as they are.
Yeah.
I think, Patrick, you actually had spoken to somebody about some of the barriers to the Olympics and what kind of...
Yeah, I mean, I just know enough that there was some discussion that because there was not a physical component to the competition, that there was some lack of belief that it could be introduced into the Olympics. But I mean, we've seen since 2017, the International Olympic Committee did say that they were open to esports. So at least it opened up the opportunity for. And then what we see is, for instance, things like the Asian Games. They've done things to bring in Korea and China to compete. And so we're seeing that it's getting adopted other places, that there are essentially state-sponsored activities, which you would imagine to, kind of increase the profile of a particular country and, create prestige for players. And so we are seeing that there are individual countries that are really pushing towards this. Whether or not it gets adopted, and one day we'll see it in the Summer Olympics, that's unknown, but at least there are people that are trying to push that.
And there are ways to have an aerobic, basis for esports. I mean, there's certainly racing simulators can have a fairly large physical, impact. And there's with VR games and there's some other technologies that might make it to where that there is at least if not a hybrid sort of esport, concept, that there are some potential aerobic possibilities in the near future. But, the Olympics are a fairly conservative organization as a whole. So sure. Also, with the COVID stuff, maybe a lot of that stuff might get accelerated, because if we're not going to have the Olympics until next year, or maybe even beyond, maybe start thinking about things that you might not have been wanting to do before that. So.
Right. So when we talk about the elite professional athletes, they go through a anti-doping protocol to make sure that everything is completely legitimate from the performance perspective. It was interesting when we talked a few weeks ago that you mentioned that is also happening in esports. Could you explain a little bit about that?
in any sport or competition where there's large prize pools, you're going to find people that are trying to game the system or try and get an edge, right? So for anti-doping, what I know today is that people are, there is use of Adderall, which is typically used to treat, attention deficit disorder. For gamers, what it's typically doing, it's either calming them down in stressful situations, or it's allowing them to stay competing or practicing for long periods of time. But what we've also seen is leagues and tournament organizers really come in and protect against those abuses. We've also seen different governing bodies, be it from the countries or whatnot, come in and try and create some regulation or targeted testing before competition to really kind of combat the use of it. Plus, the community is probably they want to self-regulate. They don't want people to come in and take advantage of those prize pool opportunities or, put their team at a disadvantage by putting the team at risk.
I think my only thing I would add is I'm not sure how widespread it is. I know that I'm sure that it does happen. I personally haven't seen it, but that doesn't mean that it isn't an issue. Patrick's right. There's always incentives. And certainly we've seen, scandals with other kinds of cheating as well. In
sure.
Sports. I'm glad that it doesn't appear to be a widespread issue at this point. It's good.
Well, and it's nice to hear that there is some sort of self-regulation. I would imagine that, those participants would want that to happen because it legitimizes what they're doing, and it also prevents people from taking over whatever platform they're on. So that's good to hear. So I think most people are familiar with EA Sports, and they've obviously got a game called Madden. If nobody's heard the 30 for 30 podcast that ESPN does on the Madden game, you should all take a listen. It's really interesting. That game had a huge influence on how Fox covers the NFL now, or at least has done it since the game came out. And there was a lot of adapting to the way that football game had added sound effects and microphones and certain ways of looking at replays and stuff. Have you been a part of any innovations with some of these games that could benefit regular sports? And maybe that's too loaded of a question, so feel free to answer how you want there.
I mean, that is a great podcast. I have listened to that one, and it's not a surprise whenever you get something that's that popular and that engaging. Like, it makes sense to learn what you can from that and then try to look at ways to do that. I mean, we're doing that constantly with other sports. I mean, we're watching reality shows. We're doing all of the sorts of things that we're looking for production and storytelling techniques. I think that from an innovation perspective, and this is one thing that makes us a little bit of a different kind of organization than most people in the broadcast space, is because we have a development team and we do a fair bit of interactive work. I think that the innovation that we're doing that's going to actually carry over into the traditional television is going to be the way that we consume the media and the way we interact. Mm-hmm. And so on a top level, you see it kind of with like The Voice or American Idol, where people get to vote and do things like that. That's definitely a big part of the kinds of shows that we tend to do. But even earlier this week, my got a 10-year-old in the house, and she's like, hey, I need the TV today because SpongeBob is doing SpongeBob Smarty Pants. And it's basically interactive quiz game on top of the show that all the kids across the country have been playing. And so I'm like, we've been doing that for quite a while as interactive components in the broadcast that we do. And so it was sort of, validating, like, this is pretty cool that it's actually reached, it's on Nickelodeon and kids are aware of this sort of thing. So those are the sorts of things that I think that where we can have an impact is sort of showing the way of how to interact with the broadcast and not just being a passive lean back watcher.
It's super interesting to me now that I have an idea of what goes into this part of it. Kris, how do you come up with those innovations? You have to obviously hire smart people, but how do they take place? What kind of environment do they work in to make those creative innovations happen?
The first kind of leg up that we need is when the platforms we stream on start to offer us tools that we can use. We work with Mixer, we work with Twitch, and so some of the conversations that we have with those folks working with the tools that they provide. So both of those platforms provide interactive overlays that we can do. So we can actually put software on top of the broadcast And that allows us to do any number of different, integrations. Like we could put stats into the show, or we can do quizzing, polling, gamification, like playing fantasy sports and things like that are all kind of projects that we've explored and implemented. So a lot of it comes down to what is capable on the platform, but then a lot of it is when we're working with usually the producers that we're working with at the client, and then our internal production team or our internal producers are usually looking for, hey, this is a gap we have in the storytelling process. How can we build something that would engage our viewership a little bit more? Because we're finding that people that are engaged, when we do digital engagement and interactive components, we actually get longer watch times on the show. So, and that's usually the performance indicators that our publisher partners want, is that they're looking for total viewership hours is one of the most common, metrics. So, it just comes down to a creative process of getting into a room and being like, okay, well, what's on the stuff that we can do that would be, fun for the community, and doesn't necessarily, break the bank. So it's similar to some of the innovations I've heard you talk about on this podcast, is when there's a challenge, whether it's, horse racing or, like in the Madden crossover too, is that Fox is looking at, like, how can we improve our audio game, the way that we cover replays? It's just taking inspiration from wherever you can and then start thinking about it creatively.
Kris, you'd mentioned your daughter, participating in the SpongeBob stuff. The young people with gaming seems to be getting more and more traction. I think it's just a product of the technology and the times. What is the future with youth for gaming?
Yeah, I know Patrick has a ton of experience too with sort of, amateur eSports, and he'll have a couple things to say for sure. I'm of the mind that it's going to be probably as big as any other varsity sport. We're starting to see a ton of high schools start to have esports teams. I think that probably within our lifetimes, it will be, similar to a basketball or football style, participation levels of kids. So I'm pretty optimistic that that's where we're gonna head. I hope, being somebody who's into sports and things, I really hope that it doesn't replace traditional sports, but augment it as another thing that kids of different skills can get involved in and have a positive team building kind of activity to do. I think that it's going to be a much, much bigger part of culturally is the high school and middle school experience growing up.
Patrick?
Yeah, it's amazing what's going on in the amateur scene right now. I'll just say it for college esports, it's been around since 2011. There have been a number of leagues that were started, and they were grassroots, right? They were student run. But it wasn't really until 2014 when the assistant athletic director, Kurt Melcher, over at Robert Morris University, offered the first college scholarship, that it just changed the whole game. And it really put college esports on the map. Today, what we see is there's roughly 200 programs, let's say, that are recognized by their university. So they have like a traditional coach. Could be seen as intramurals, but nevertheless, the school, the institution recognizes it. Then you have probably about another 200 to 300 schools that are just primarily student run. When you look at that in the larger context of in the U.S. market of 3,200 colleges and universities, it's still small and it's still growing, but nevertheless, it's growing. And what you can look at are things like, for instance, Marquette University. It right now kind of has taken the title of being the first Division I big school to have esports part of its varsity athletic program. So that ushers in, that for the future for other institutions. Also, you look at the things like scholarships that are available. Just this last year, we had reportedly between about $10 to $20 million of college scholarship available to students. Again, when you compare that with college football, it's a drop in the bucket, but nevertheless, you're seeing conferences pay attention. You're seeing big college-specific gaming conventions. You're seeing the likes of like even the college football series coming in and trying to create events that draw from those players so they can come to, their traditional sports events. So it's a big deal, and it needs to be paid attention to, and it is going to get bigger, like Kris said.
What's the most successful event that you've been a part of?
I'd like to think that they're all successful in some manner.
Yeah.
But
the most notable then.
The most notable. No, a lot of these events are extremely challenging on a number of levels. There's just a lot of moving pieces, and the ones I'm most proud of, though, the one that we did at the 24-hour Le Mans, where we basically did a 24-hour broadcast. That was pretty intense, and we didn't have the crew that you would normally have for an event like that. So it was quite an experience, and being there at the Le Mans, being part of the actual formal. It was part of the official race. It was the fifth race, I think. You had all the, I guess there would be three classes and then our class, and being up on the, being able to go up on the podium and seeing all that. And I'm a huge race nut, so I'm a car guy. Being able to go to Le Mans and experience that. The only thing I kind of didn't enjoy is the fact that I had a all access pass anywhere at the racetrack and in the paddock and all that. And because I was so busy, I didn't get a chance to even go and hang out and do any of that. So, but that one I think is kind of one of my favorite events and extremely difficult event, but was, looking back, one of the ones I liked the best.
I could say that my favorite event over the last couple of years has been working with military bases. So Atomic had the opportunity to work with the fourth largest base in the world, that's Joint Base Lewis McChord, in our backyard, and seeing how the military is embracing esports, and gone is the way of the traditional board game and ping pong table and and all the traditional games. Service members want to use technology, and so seeing the military embrace esports, and then from Atomic's perspective, being able to go in and really build a program from scratch. Typically, again, when we work with clients, they're telling us about their requirements. And in this case, they really were open arms and really looked to our expertise to kind of build something. And that was very rewarding, especially to see the service members just really appreciate kind of the white glove treatment that we can give that they're just not used to seeing with, football or basketball.
As we close up our conversation here, which again to me is super fascinating and really interesting, I've learned a lot. What would you like sports fans to know about esports from a production perspective that they might not otherwise know?
Well, one of the things that I find is, I really, really enjoy working with folks that are working in the traditional sports space. I always get a kick out of that because my background, I actually come from more of a technical side of it. So more of the computer and networking and software side. And so my background as a producer is primarily in esports. And so I always enjoy it when I get to work with, traditional sports facilities and personnel. So I think one of the things that I would encourage people that are working in the sports industry is maybe give it a shot and take a look at opportunities in the esports space and reach out to us or whoever. We're always looking for additional partners to work with. And it's pretty fun and a tight-knit group. And we get to go do some traveling and different things that are a pretty great experience. And it's a very challenging space, similar to traditional sports. It's a little different. And so anybody who's got a background in broadcast production, try working on an esports production. You'll probably get a kick out of it. And there's certainly, from an opportunity perspective, if you think about it, you think about how there's big conference sports, there's different places where you can go work, right? There's working for MLB teams, doing broadcast production, NFL. Well, think about it in terms of how many more opportunities you're going to have in the esports space. There's thousands of games and different programs that are out there to work on. So there's a lot of work to be had. We encourage anybody to kind of check it out and dip their toes.
Patrick, did you want to add anything to that?
I think people need to know that esports is just about community. In traditional sports, I grew up playing traditional sports, and we put our players on pillars and we find them kind of inaccessible. And I think with esports, it's all about community. It's all about engagement. So we find that the players really are accessible. The talent, the casters and analysts, they're answering questions from their community and part of the community, using these social platforms. They're one and the same. And so there's something magical going on in esports. And like Kris said, I think if you haven't been a part of it or you haven't experienced to test the waters, you should certainly do so.
If people want to know more about what Atomic does in the esports landscape with in regards to production, what can they do?
The simplest thing is, we put together a whole, call it a webinar, but call it a kind of an introduction to esports that folks could just ask for. And basically, we kind of detail all aspects of esports and answer a lot of those questions in a flyer, and they can do that. That's one way.
It's exactly the same kind of stuff you got to do if you want to, work for, a sports broadcaster. It's about who you know and getting out there and just starting to do work. So there's a lot of, amateur esports tournaments and things like that to go and volunteer at and be part of as helping operate a tournament. A lot of those smaller ones don't have large broadcast components,
Sure.
But there's also, streaming on Twitch and getting part of the community. And if you like video games and you have a broadcast background, you could probably kick some butt doing, stuff on Twitch or YouTube. So I would encourage doing things like that. You're going to find a community, and then you're going to get opportunities. And certainly, reach out to me on Twitter or email me or whatever. We have a vendor database, and we like to network with people when we get a chance to. It's you got to get out there and meet people, and you're going to find opportunities. My Twitter handle is Kris Dahl. It's KrisDahl. And then our website is weareatomic.com, or our studio is seattleesportsstudio.com. And you can reach out to me, DM or whatever, and we'll love to start some conversations.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. I learned a lot on this episode, and it gives me some things to think about for the future of where production can go. So, I'm sure there's a lot more for me to learn, so I'm going to definitely do my research, and perhaps in the future one day we can do an update and bring you back on.
Sounds great.
That'd be great. Love the podcast.
Thank you.
Hopefully we'll get a chance to work on a production sometime in the future. It'd be pretty cool.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thanks, Don.
All right, there's Kris Dahl and Patrick Barthe of Atomic, a company that works with esports organizations and utilizes technology to help their productions. It'll be interesting to see how much esports will have an impact on the sporting world in the future after COVID-19. And I'll be checking out some of those games to see if I'd be able to have a chance at making millions of dollars in competition. Again, if you'd like to find out more about what Atomic does, visit weareatomic.com. And I look forward to seeing the potential of esports in the future. On the next episode of the Sports in the Making podcast, it seems as if social media has been around for decades now, but it wasn't that long ago that sports organizations were using interns to reach out to fans. That's completely changed now to where social media can break news, provide creative outlets for athletes and brands, and if not done properly, can damage the reputation of anyone who uses it. I'll talk with Aaron Eisman of Eisman Digital Consulting, who has worked with the NBA on TNT, Bleacher Report, and the NFL Network to help develop social media strategies, and he now works with agencies and athletes to maximize their social efforts as well. It's an interesting conversation on the social media landscape, and it can help businesses who are trying to do social media as well. If you have any suggestions on what you'd like to know more about in sports, drop me a line at sportsinthemaking.com or contact me on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. And if you have any questions, I'd love to include them in a future episode with your name. Wherever you listen to this podcast, I'd appreciate it if you like it, share it, and leave positive reviews on your social media channels. Also be sure to subscribe to Sports in the Making so you don't miss out on more episodes, and you can catch up on previous ones there as well. I'm your host, Don Cardona. Thank you for listening to Sports in the Making.